you really digested what you want the viewer to really get across. So keeping things simple and also, trying to create your own style.
Hi everyone, thanks for tuning into Nodes of Design. To help support our mission spread knowledge, we have a very special guest on today's episode. Let's welcome Kieron, who is a London-based freelance designer and a public speaker. Over the years, he had designed numerous self-directed and client-based projects for clients such as HarperCollins, Penguin Books, Levi's and Adobe. In this episode, Kieron had shared great insights on editorial design. We had discussed on what is editorial design and what are the classic elements of editorial design. We then spoke on how to establish visual hierarchy and balance layouts in editorial work, and Kieron has explained us his process of editorial design. We then spoke about how to choose the right font and how do we explore different varieties before jumping into choosing one particular font for editorial design. We then concluded the show by Kieron recommending us few tips on how to create an editorial design portfolio. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and on every Friday we release new episodes with different creative leaders from around the world to help you better understand different concepts related to design. So don't forget to tune in into Notes of Design every Friday. With that being said, happy designing everyone. Hi Kieron, welcome to Nodes of Design. It's a pleasure hosting you today on our show.
Thank you for having me. How are you doing?
All good, Kieron. How was your day?
It was good. It's 8:40 in Spain, so it's still early in the morning, but I've had my coffee, so I'm good. I'm ready to go.
That's wonderful, Kieron. If you could give a brief about yourself to our audience out there.
Sure. So I'm a freelance graphic designer based in London. Primarily, I work with editorial design, but I've also got a skill in marketing, branding, and UI design. Some of the clients that I work with are Adobe, Penguin, Levi's, and HarperCollins.
That's wonderful, Kieron. So what was your journey into design and how did you start? And what are your tips to the beginners on how to start?
Oh, that's a good question. Okay, we're going back a few years now. So I originally studied graphic design as my degree at university. But whilst I was studying at university, I was doing a lot of self-directed projects. So I worked with a group of guys and we created a magazine in our very first year of uni. So that was kind of my real insight into how, working on projects that weren't given by the lecturers, but projects we wanted to really do ourselves. And whilst in my university career for 3 years, I was also doing an internship at an advertising agency. So every summer I'd go back during my breaks and I'd work at a digital agency based in London. And then I would work on projects for Miss Dior and MasterCard, so like digital banners. So that was my first insight into the working world, into the experience of design. And for my tips and my advice I'd give, very much working on projects that you want to work on. Self-directed projects are so important. It's good to work with, clients and work and get given a brief and a branding guidelines, but also it's quite nice to work on, those passion projects, because for me, when you work on those projects, it really shows, your network and the people that you're working with, that you're really interested and really invested in your work. And on the back of that, also collaborating too. That's very important, collaborating with your peers, and also working with different skill sets, combining skill sets. If you're a graphic designer, working with a photographer, working with an illustrator, the network is so big. So why not, utilize that space?
Thank you, Kieron. So let's begin today our episode with editorial design. So what exactly is editorial design and what are the classic elements of editorial design?
Sure, that's a good question. I always feel that everyone's going to have a different perspective on what that question is. I mean, from my perspective on it, it's kind of broken into sort of 4 categories. You have typography, you have layout, you have format, you have production. And the idea is a bit like when you would create a meal, you have the ingredients and it's how you work with those ingredients to create something, beautiful and impactful. The idea, obviously, with elements that you construct it, you design it in a certain way. And then the idea is usually within my line of work, it will be in the format of a book or magazine. So editorial layout design. And it's basically working with those 4 elements to construct it in a much more impactful and engaging way. Yeah, so with those elements I spoke about, so typography, so firstly, this is quite an interesting one because you have a lot of different fonts that you can work with and in the space. And the idea within my work is understanding first the content and understanding what content is appropriate for what typography. So it's not a case of just picking any font. It needs to kind of feel like it's right for that content. So that's a very important part. With layout, we'll touch on this shortly, but editorial design, how the hierarchy, how people, view when they first look at the page. That's very important, especially if they're not from a design background. You can't assume people who look at your work is from the design community. So it's important to have an understanding of how people first view a design. In terms of format, again, there's different variations of how that would be, depending on if it's digital or whether it's print. I primarily work within the print sector. So a lot of my work, I'd make sure that I'm making, the right colors, that I work on the right print stock, understanding if it's a book, what kind of binding do you use? And there's so many elements to kind of work within, but it's understanding, what is the best format for what you want to create. And then the final part, production, which is very important because once you've designed, your creation on the computer, understanding that process. So for myself, it's very much a print process, understanding, what colors work best on what print stock, understanding, if you are working on a very large document, a large book, the gutter space in between so that no text is centered and it's cut off. And obviously key legibility, it's very important when you create a design, especially a book. It might look beautiful, but if it's not, the font is the right size, then it's very difficult to read. So that is very important. So those four main things I'd say are the kind of, real classic elements of editorial design.
Thank you so much, Kieron. So how to establish a visual hierarchy and balance the layout in editorial work? If you could explain us the editorial design process.
Sure. So with visual hierarchy, we all know that's the order of importance within design. So understanding what is the very most important thing you first want to see when you first get design. Visual hierarchy, it does complement having a balanced layout of edited design too. However, I've always found the best way, to create a visually engaging, clear and simple is to experiment, creating variations. That's very important because, when you create various designs, you're able to reflect, digest on what works well, and also sharing with other people. It's very easy to work within your space and almost have quite tunnel vision and just see it from your perspective. But when you create variations, you can share with people, you can get their perspective on it, and in that way, once you've seen what you're working with, you can make the best possible final decision, which I always find very, very important.
Thank you, Kieron. So how to choose the right font and how do you explore different varieties? Because those are the major important aspects of editorial design.
That is a good question. So a good example is I recently created a 300-page publication. So a very, very big book. So you can imagine there's a lot of fonts and typographic layouts and editorials, designs, and a lot of things happening. But for myself, the first thing I had to do was make sure understanding the mood of the content. And understanding, what is the real essence of this project before you do any design work. Because once you have an idea of the mood and the content, you're able to create the right font. And more importantly, understanding, will this font distract from the design? So within the project I worked on, it was touching on race within the UK. So it's a very sensitive but very important topic. So I had to make sure that the fonts that I use, it wouldn't cloud over the real impactful content that everyone that was featured was really trying to get across. And sometimes, when you're working on a project like this, there's a lot of elements, like I said, that you work with. So I tend to use Lorem Ipsum, which is like dummy copy. And when I get my copy in place, it gives me an idea roughly of how things will look for the final product. So usually you might work with a copywriter, which I did within the publisher as well. And I would give them examples of how copy would look with simple copy and with a lot of copy. And then we're able to make a really good design choice on what would work well. And also, there's an element of fun. You need to have fun with it. And with fonts, it's a little bit like, Willy Wonka in a chocolate factory, where you have all these options to kind of choose from. And you think, I could choose that one and that one. And again, coming back to our previous question, it's the idea of, creating layouts, creating variations to sort of, take a step back, reflect, understand, which one will work best for that final deliverable.
Thank you, Kieron. So how do you do storytelling via words and how do you establish a connection with readers via these words?
That's a good question. So I actually recently gave a talk on this with DNAD, and it was covering the importance of words within design. And with words, it's an interesting one because it can evoke so many different emotions. The way of how you engage with the viewers and what you would say, whether it's funny, informative, inspiring, there's various emotions that can come with it. And I always find for me, keeping it simple, doing the basics very well, I always find that's the most engaging because when you try to overcomplicate it, it can dilute what the real message is about. So I always find if, you create a very strong, hard-hitting story, keeping it simple for the readers, they can be much more engaged with what you're trying to get across. And also it doesn't help, it doesn't hurt, I should say, to make it funny, kind of create those emotions. I love a good funny read, or even, a very informative or inspiring one. Those elements that, people will remember it more for. And that's the key, I would find. If you create anything, whether it's a poster or a book, making sure that it's memorable. People can remember, there's a lot of content that's out there for people to digest, creating something that is impactful, inspiring, but also memorable. And that can be more through, the evoke of through laughter and through emotion. That's very, very important.
Okay, if you could explain us in detail your process of following the editorial design and what are the various things that you do?
Sure. So before I do any, actual computer design work, I always have my Moleskine, I should say, Moleskine/Notepad. And I'd always draw my layouts first. It's so important for me. It's important to have a really basic understanding of where things would sit. So before I do any computer work, I'd always draw out ideas of where things would sit using boxes and key lines, and also visual research. I always do a bit of research into understanding, what I'm trying to create before I just jump straight on the computer. For me, it's important to kind of have those, basic foundation of where things would sit, what kind of design I want to create. And then once you've kind of got those, pieces in place, creating my assets folder. So with the book that I created, with the 300 pages, there's a lot of content, there's a lot of text, a lot of imagery, and it's very important to keep things in a very organized way. Otherwise, it can be crazy. So I would create my asset folders for my images right up to my content for each page, where things would sit. And then once I've got all of my tools ready to get going, I create my InDesign document. So I create my grids, which is very important. And, grids is that basic foundation that you need for any editorial design, because once you have your grids in place, you can understand where things will be aligned with imagery right up to text. And again, we touched on visual hierarchy. You can use your alignment tool to make sure where your eyes will follow. So all of these elements all work coherent with one another. It's that universal space where everything kind of works in sync with one another. And touching on that as well with color. Colors is a very important one because, again, touching on with words and how words can be quite emotive, color can also be quite emotive as well. So there's different colors that can reflect different emotions. So again, with my own process, I tend not to go straight into color. It's understanding the basic skeleton of the design. So text, imagery, layout, and once that's in a good place, adding color is like almost adding the cherry on the cake.
That's a great explanation, Kieron. Thank you so much for that. So what are your tips to the beginners in creating an editorial design portfolio?
Key for myself is keeping it simple. I think it's very easy to overcomplicate things, especially when you're just starting out, because you want to put your best work in there. And sometimes quantity, it's quality very much. So we've probably heard it many times, but that's very true. When I'm looking at portfolios myself, I'd rather see, 4 strong designs rather than 7 average ones, because one, it shows, from my perspective, you're confident in your work, but also as well, it's, you really digested what you want the viewer to really get across. So keeping things simple, and also, trying to create your own style. It's a difficult thing, where with social media, it's very easy to compare yourself to other people. And it's a natural thing. I think it's something where, especially we've all been in lockdown in this whole period with COVID, social media has taken even more of a central point for how designers operate. And when you have things like LinkedIn or Instagram, these platforms are great because you can share your work, but then you can also feel a bit discouraged if you see other people in your space. So I'd always say the key is to, really understand your own style, and it's good to take influence, but always do you. Always keep true to yourself. Find yourself first, and then your style will follow. And then finally, just on that, I touched on this in terms of my own experience, but having a good balance in your portfolio of client-based work, but also self-directed work, because when you have the two, it shows a variety of different things. But the main important thing I always find is that when you've got client work, it shows that you're able to work to a brief, you're able to understand how things operate within a certain client. But then on the other side, when you have the self-directed work, it really shows an interest in the craft, which I feel is just as important, because when you show that, it's something that you can't fake that. I think you can always tell when people are generally interested in the passion, whether it's design or any other craft or any job, you can really see there's a true engagement with it, which for me is very important, because when you love what you do, you create your best work.
That's wonderful, Kieron. Thank you so much. So could you please share with us, how does your typical day look like, or any interesting stories?
Sure. Well, my day will always start with coffee. It would always start with a coffee and a fresh orange juice before I operate. And then when I'm in a good place, I will be, browsing through blogs, reading the news, checking emails. I do tend to have a lot of emails. But the beauty of working for myself as a freelance is that I have control with my day. And that's something I've never always had. As when you're working in a full time, there's obviously structure in place. But for me, going freelance officially this year was a very healthy thing, mentally too. So yeah, I'll start my day with a good coffee. I'll be reading my blogs and my emails. And then every day I'll always do a to-do list. So I try not to go straight on the computer, because I do love good old-fashioned pen to paper. And there's something about ticking off your list. It's the essence of just bringing old school. So I love to do that. So I'll tick off my to-do list for the day. And then once I know, okay, this is what I'm working on from 9 to 5, before I go on the computer, I'll go for a walk. I'm very, very fortunate where I live. There's a few lakes, a lot of countryside. So I'll go for a walk just to get my mind in the right state before it's full on computer. It can get quite intense. So I'm in a good place. And then yeah, my main tools are InDesign, Photoshop, Illustrator. They're like my babies. So then, yeah, once I've had my walk, I've had my coffee, I'm in a good place, and then I can just start designing.
Thank you so much, Kieron, for sharing all these wonderful insights with us. So we'll conclude the show by you recommending 3 favorite books of yours, and also people who inspire you the most in this space.
So there's a very good book that I'd recommend for, especially if you're just starting out in the creative industry. And it's called It's Not How Good You Are, It's How Good You Want to Be. And it's a book by Paul Arden. And this is quite it's a mixture of things. It's a very simple read, a very easy read, but it's also quite a humorous book too. And it provides unique insight into the world of advertising. Now, even though it's advertising, it touches on the creative industry as a whole. And what's great about that is that, it gives you a real in-depth truth of what it's like to work in the creative industry. We touched on social media, where it can almost show the very shiny parts of design. But as human beings, we all have issues, we all have failures. And this book is great because it really highlights those points, which for me, that's just as important as showing the perfect parts of the design as well. It's showing the stuff that you don't necessarily always hear. So that's a very good book that I recommend for young creatives out there. And also 2 books I've actually had a part myself in actually designing, which I'm quite fortunate, is the publication I spoke about at the beginning, which is a 300-page document. And this was called Still Breathing, 100 Black Voices. And this was a publication edited by Suzette Lowen and Suzanne Packer. And this publication is a very, very powerful one, because it touches on what's current in the world today, which is actually, racism, especially in the UK. And there's 100 people involved, and everyone shares their experiences of what they've been through, whether it's within the sector of politics or sport or fashion. They've all got their stories in there. And, the idea of this book was to go out there to educate, to inspire, and to really create an honest conversation on what racism really is in the world, but more particularly in the UK. So I'd always recommend, that's it's not an easy read, it's an intense read, but again, it's a very much needed read and a very impactful one. So, for those that are, following politics and, understanding, this is a very important sector that we need to address. This is a very interesting book. And the final book I'd recommend, again, is another one that I had the opportunity to work on, is called Dare to Change. And this was part of a project I worked with Penguin Books. And it's an inspiring piece because, again, it follows a boxer called Lawrence Oakley. And it's showcasing, how he started off his career. He was, bullied in school, but now he's a world champion boxer. So again, you're kind of following his journey, an inspiring journey of how, you can start from where you're at and then be where you want to be. So I was quite fortunate to work on the cover. But again, that's it's a very light-hearted read, but it's a very inspiring one too. So I'd recommend those 3 books. They're very different, But again, hopefully there's one of those books that you could find engaging, and you can pick one that you enjoy. So there's one, there's no multiple people, but there's one person that really comes to mind, and it's Stefan Sagmeister. And for those of you who don't know who he is, he's very bold and brave. I think those are quite two key words that you would associate with Stefan Sagmeister and his work. And quite controversial as well, which is a good thing I always find. When you're on that fine line between, is that too far, or is, that's okay. One particular project he worked on was an exhibition. It was called The Happy Show. And The Happy Show offers visitors the experience of walking through Stefan Sagmeister's mind, which is a little bit like a Willy Wonka chocolate factory for designers. It's crazy, it's wild, but it's also quite immersive. So if you can go on his website, you can see the exhibition that he put on. And the idea is, the real focal point of it was to increase happiness via meditation. So there's different things he has happening in the exhibition itself, which unfortunately I haven't had a chance to actually go to, because it's a bit far from where I am. But from everything I've seen online, and you can do like a virtual tour, it just looks incredible. So again, he's someone who I really take influence from, and I've been following his work from when I was at university myself. And everything that he creates is just from editorial design right up to digital, right up to podcast covers. He's just he's one of those guys where, if you're a graphic designer or creative individual, you most likely would have heard his name before, because he's a very, very impactful and important person in our industry. So very much recommend checking him out.
Thank you so much, Kieron, for sharing all these wonderful insights and recommendations with us. So we are looking forward to host you again in our upcoming episodes. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.